Okay. Okay, let's get started. Hello and welcome everyone, wherever you may be joining us today. My name is Yunus Sangyabadi, and I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, a foreign policy think tank operating in both the United States and Canada, dedicated to promoting sustainable peace through dialogue, diplomacy, and constructive engagement, all grounded in a realist and interest-based approach. We are holding this discussion at a particularly unprecedented time in the Middle East. After years of being avoided through diplomacy and often discussed by analysts as the worst-case scenario concerning the Iran nuclear program, the Israel-Iran war finally became a reality earlier this month. Many describe it as the war Prime Minister Netanyahu long dreamt about and worked for to make it happen, and he finally did succeed, not only in triggering a military confrontation against Iran, but also in securing direct U.S. military involvement, with President Trump ordering U.S. strikes on key Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, the big question is, did Israel and the United States achieve their strategic objectives through such military actions? Some preliminary intelligence reports suggest Iran may still retain enough enriched uranium and advanced centrifuges, giving it the potential capability, depending on many factors that we'll discuss, to produce a nuclear bomb within months, if they wish to do so. And if that's the case, these strikes may have been tactically very successful and effective in undermining Iran's nuclear and military capabilities overall, but strategically, not so much if Iran still has what it takes to go nuclear. On the other hand, if, however, Iran's nuclear infrastructures are severely degraded and destroyed, as claimed by the Trump administration, this is both strategic and political victory for both Netanyahu and Trump himself. But again, another big question is, for how long exactly? As we know that the Islamic Republic is now more motivated than ever to go all in, considering that their nuclear threshold state failed to establish deterrence against Israel as a nuclear armed state. A good indication of this shift is the Iranian parliament voting to cease cooperation with the IAEA, a move that makes it much more difficult to prevent a full nuclear breakout if the Iranians, again, manage to save the enriched uranium materials and the advanced centrifuges following the strikes. Beyond this nuclear dimension, it's important for all of us to not forget nor downplay how this 12-day war shook the entire region. While the Gulf states, especially Qatar, have positioned themselves as backers of diplomacy, they were also dragged into this conflict against their will. Following US strikes, Iran launched what appears to have been a coordinated and symbolic attack on the US base in Qatar, as America's largest military base in the region, while Qatar was also working behind the scene to broker the very ceasefire that is in place now. That ceasefire is holding for now, but will it last or not is another big question that we will tackle today. Even if it holds, the strategic and psychological impact of this war will be profound and long-lasting. In Tehran, Tel Aviv, and Doha, civilian population, many of them young people from Gen Z, heard and saw missiles fall in or near their cities. For many, this was the first time war felt so close to home. The trauma from this experience will shape public narratives, political decisions, and defense strategies for years to come, not only in the Middle East, but also beyond. We already see the discussions happening even in Pakistan as a nuclear armed state. Inside the United States itself, we're also seeing unprecedented division over the US direct military involvement in this war. Key figures within the Trump's own MAGA base, such as Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon, have publicly opposed this war, blaming what they describe as a pro-Israel neoconservative faction for dragging America into yet another costly and endless war in the Middle East, sought by the one and only usual suspect, Prime Minister Netanyahu. This internal rift is important, not just politically, but also strategically, because it could shape the future of US-Israel relations and US engagement in the region, especially as the 2026 midterm election cycle soon begins to heat up. And all of this is happening while other major developments are unfolding, such as the US sanction relief on Iran following the strikes to enable the country to export its oil to China. Israel continued military operations in Gaza and South Lebanon, potential deal on Gaza, and talks of some Arab states, including Syria, joining the Abraham Accords. So to help make sense of these big questions, We are honored to be joined by an outstanding panel of experts from the region itself, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Before I briefly introduce our panelists, let me very quickly share some housekeeping notes for our online audience. We'll begin the session with opening remarks from each speaker, about 3 to 4 minutes, 5 minutes maximum, focus on the strategic objectives, decisions, and evolving positions of each countries they're following closely. Then we'll move into a moderated session where panelists are also encouraged to respectfully challenge and also build on others' insight. And in the meantime, our audience members, they can submit their question using the Q&A box function on Zoom, and I'll do my best to bring in some of your questions toward the end. Joining us from the United Kingdom, we have Dr. Roxane Farmanfarmayan, Academic Director of International Relations and Global Studies at the University of Cambridge Institute for Continuing Education, and also a member of our advisory board at IPD. From Israel, he just joined us. We have Danny Sitrinovich, Senior Researcher for the Iran and Shia Access Program at the Institute for National Security Studies, known as INSS. Joining us from Doha, we're honored to have with us Sheikh Nawaf Al-Thani, former Director of Qatari Defense Intelligence Operation and former Defense Attaché to the US, Canada, and Mexico. He also serves on our advisory board at IPD. From Washington, we have with us John Hoffman, Research Fellow in Defense and Foreign Policy Program at the Cato Institute. Last but definitely not least, joining us from Geneva, Farzan Sabet, another great fellow Iranian Canadian like myself, also a good friend who currently serves as a managing researcher for the Sanctioned and Sustainable Peace Hub at the Geneva Graduate Institute. We are very fortunate to have this level of expertise and diversity of perspectives around the table. And without further ado, let's get started. To begin, I would like to ask all of our panelists pretty much the same opening questions to better understand the different perspectives and interests regarding this war. For Danny and John, my question is about the strategic objectives behind this war for both Israel and the United States, and whether those objectives were achieved, and if so, to what extent, and if they didn't, in what ways they failed and why. And for Roxane, Nawaf, and Farzan, similar question, but regarding Iran and Qatar, as well as the broader Gulf region. How did the governments in Tehran, Doha, and other GCC capitals perceive these Israeli surprise attacks, as well as the US direct involvement in the war, and how this impacted their threat perception, as well as the regional foreign and defense strategies since the war broke out? And I believe it will be good to start with Danny from Israel to better understand why this started in the first place, and then we'll go around the table to hear other perspectives. Danny, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Yunus. Thank you for inviting me for this important panel. Definitely interesting times in the Middle East in general. And I want to touch by saying that before I touch the strategic goals of Israel, to emphasize the fact that we are not done yet, meaning that the situation is very, very unstable. And with that, a political agreement definitely, and the statement of the Israeli defense minister saying that Israel is going to attack any Iranian ambition to rebuild its capabilities, strategic one, not only, by the way, in the nuclear, but also air defense and the missile array, that I think if we'll do that, definitely the war will renew again, maybe some sort of attrition war. So I'm not sure that we're done yet. Yes, we can conclude what happened in the 12 days of war between Iran and Israel, but we're still on very, very unstable ground in so many ways. I'll start by saying that there were declared goals for Israel in this operation, and some non-declared probably. And I think that, and I'll say in general, despite the Israeli operational achievements, I'm not sure that strategically Israel gained what it wanted to do. And I think that this is very important to emphasize. Because in Israel, there is a lot of euphoria about what happened in the last 12 days. But I think that we need to look at this war in a broader picture of the relations between Iran and Israel. And Iran is the fearsome enemy. Israel never has conducted a war against this kind of an enemy, a regional superpower. And despite operational superiority, again, we'll touch it a little bit probably, for sure, I will touch it, but maybe other panelists in terms of the broader terms of what Iran might do. So Israel went to the war, two main objectives, lifting or eliminating the nuclear threat on Israel, from Iran, and of course, eliminating the missile capability or limiting that in some way, given the fact that you cannot destroy the last launcher or the last missile. And it has also one other element related to the fact that Israel wants to create the objective for good political agreement with Iran, meaning no enrichment and no missile buildup and things like that. And of course, we had the plus one. The plus one is Israel's ambition in terms of changing the regime in Iran. I think Israel today denied it was the objective, but definitely within the war, and the defense minister said yesterday in numerous interviews, Israel was willing to kill Khamenei, attack the Evin prison and the Basids, knowing that Israel probably tried to do something, but quickly understood that, and this is actually one thing that we have to understand, this regime won't be easy to change. On the contrary, there's no opposition to replace it. But regarding nuclear, definitely everybody's talking about what happened. I think that it's safe to say that the Iranian nuclear program suffered significant setback. Israel severely damaged together with the US. We all know Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan, Karaj, and of course decapitating of the scientists dealing with weaponization. But we all know that Iran still has capabilities. Everybody's looking for the 60% material, enriched material, 400 kilos of it. And we all know that 321 Iran is not, there's no some sort of inspector regime on the Iranian manufacturing of centrifuges since attack happened in Karaj in 2021. So theoretically speaking, Iran has the ability to enrich today using, if it has some sort of clandestine capabilities or facilities, to enrich 90% within a couple of months. And if you're taking the 400 kilos, 60%, and adding maybe 200 centrifuges to add 6, you can reach even less than 2 months to material that will last for 2 atomic bombs. So that's one aspect. And of course, we have the aspect of the fact that Iran is not willing to give up, despite everything that happened. And we had major achievements. And I think that we suffice to see how Khamenei, President Khamenei looked yesterday in his statement, understanding that he also probably was shocked from what Israel did in the opening activity of this war. But Iran is not willing to give up. It already declared that. So the combination of Iran's willingness or ability to continue its nuclear program together with capability that left, meaning that yes, it's a setback, but it's definitely not elimination of the program. Regarding the missiles, again, goes with that saying that Israel is able to do significant damage, destroying hundreds of missiles, and especially more than half of the launchers, something that really put the Iranians in a problem in terms of executing their firing launching plan against Israel. But as we all know, despite everything that happened, Iran was able to launch a significant number of missiles against Israel, and also able to hit some significant sites in Israel, some that are already published and some that not published. But some results that we published, we saw, for example, the Weizmann Institute, very important institute in Israel, in Rehovot, and other places, of course, Haifa, the refinery. So I think that it's not, yes, we had a superiority, but I think what we're also learning is the Iranian capability to hit strategic threats in Israel. So the bottom line of things is the fact that, yes, Israel had achievements, but it didn't change the will of the Iranians to continue building the capabilities. And I think this is one important element we need to look at the future. Iran has technological platform in order to reach nuclear capabilities, military one. It's not that complex scientifically today to build a nuclear bomb. I think that maybe we touch the capabilities, but in terms of the willingness of the Iranians, the initiative to go forward, I think we only push them maybe over the Rubicon. And this is something that I'm afraid that actually what we did is we caused this result. And even more than that, now I'm not sure we're able to reach a political settlement regarding the Iranian nuclear file because of the war itself. The last thing is, of course, is the issue of, again, political settlement. I think that without this kind of settlement, that it will be very hard to reach. I think the current situation is unstable in a way, as I mentioned, that we can find ourselves in a renewed war. The bottom line of everything that said, that Israel hoping also that the achievements in this war will change the Middle East, will enable Israel to interact with Saudi Arabia, normalization, pushing Hamas to ceasefire. But I said and also wrote that in Israel that I see that is the chances of that are very minor. I think that the Gulf states actually pursue Israel behavior as a very negative one, because Israel trying to change the reality in the Middle East only by the use of force and not negotiation, not agreement. And Hamas, as we all know, has no intention to capitalize, to surrender to Israeli ambition in terms of not stopping the war in Gaza and releasing the hostages, only because of what's happening in Iran. So I think, again, major achievements on the operational side, tactically speaking. Strategically, we have to wait and see. I keep telling people in Israel, what will happen if 1 year from now, Iran will blow up some sort of nuclear device? Then how we will look at the achievement that we had because in the war, the rising lion war against Iran these days, because despite everything that happened, I'm not sure that in the end of the way, we didn't push the Iranian over the nuclear Rubicon, and will make them or made them think how to revise, how to rebuild the missiles capabilities, and maybe rebuild their air force capabilities. So we had positive things from the Israeli standpoint, but certainly it's not complete, it's not ultimate, and I'm not sure that looking in the long run, we're able to preserve these achievements.
Thank you very much, Danny, for your comprehensive opening remarks. I have many follow-up questions already, but I want to bring in Roxanne to also both respond to some of the points that Danny raised and discuss the Iranian position in this war and how it will evolve moving forward after the ceasefire.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for inviting me today. And I think it's an interesting timing, first of all. I think I agree with Danny. I think we're in a very unsettled period right now. And I'd like to, before going forward in Iran's strategic calculus, I'd like to just cast a very quick look at what it actually was hoping to do in the reason why it was in negotiations, because I think that reflects very much where we are today as well. So when it began negotiating, it had several goals. One was to avoid attack by Israel, which Netanyahu had obviously threatened for weeks, and by the fourth negotiating round had indicated he was ready to carry out. Another goal was to avoid the threat of snapbacks from the EU, which had indicated it would do that because the JCPOA is about to expire in October. And obviously, it wanted to lift sanctions in order to improve the economic conditions for its restive population. So I perceived at the time that Iran was perhaps more open to negotiations than it had been for many years. And as I understand, it was in fact about ready to give a compromise deal about a consortium for enrichment to Witkoff on the very day that got canceled in terms of negotiations in Oman. So I think it's important to look at Iran's positioning at that point. I think it was anticipating, as a result, an attack by Israel. And I think it had been for some time. So we know that it has developed a deep underground facility that is almost complete, if not entirely complete, separate from Fordo. And so it was already able to start planning to move its stockpile of highly enriched uranium to undisclosed locations. It had indicated it was going to do this and avoided doing so under satellite tracking. And it probably didn't move any centrifuges, but it very likely has been building some there and in other facilities. The third goal that it was trying to do, I think, was to rethink its entire forward defense posture. And I think this is really important. Obviously, what I mean by this is that Iran had realized that its long-term strategy had ended regarding the axis of resistance in which Hezbollah and Hamas and the Iraqi special units and the Houthis had constituted forces that would protect the territorial core of Iran from threats. In other words, I don't feel it had ever really looked at them as a means of exerting regional hegemony. It had looked at them as a forward defense. This strategy was dead, and that was made clear when the Iranian military officials were assassinated by Israel the year before at the Iranian consulate in Damascus. So, in the face of Israel's muscular aggression in the post-Gaza period, it needed to develop a different strategy in order to more heavily rely on its missile capacity in the homeland. And we saw this used, for example, the first time when Iran retaliated after the killing of General Soleimani, something that Trump even referred to during his obliteration speech. And we also saw it used again after the Damascus killings against Israel. And now, of course, we saw it again being used in Qatar. And so I think what we see is that when Israel attacked Iran, and it included decapitating the top generals of the IRGC and other key government officials and scientists, this added further to where Iran's strategic calculus was going. It knew that its intelligence and scientific community were vulnerable, but this made it extremely clear. And obviously today it is focused very much using arrests and executions, as well as the passage of a new law against collusion with the enemy to tighten its net around its own intelligence security. However, so far it has stopped short of formally withdrawing from the NPT, although it has stated uncategorically that it, from its perspective, and as you say, Eunice, who does one believe, that it will continue its nuclear program, implying that it has got enough to use the word continue. And it has also stated that it does not yet feel that or it is not planning on building a bomb. I think the new calculus also was adjusted when the United States attacked Iran. I think that was more of a surprise. The Israeli attack was not. This was the second nuclear country to attack it in a week, despite its facilities being under IAEA inspections right at that very moment. And despite the IAEA saying there was absolutely no evidence of weaponization. And so I think this shifted the calculation. It felt it was very unprotected by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The IAEA did not come out very immediately with a condemnation of the attack. And since then, the Iranian parliament, backed up by the supreme leader, has indicated that it will cut its relationship with the IAEA for the moment. And the sites must become protected, it has said, and it must have a right to enrich low-grade uranium, as confirmed by the agency. And this is an interesting extension of its calculation, because obviously this could trigger renewed Israeli attacks, especially if Trump's own claims are found to be untrue, and also Israel's that the obliteration took place. But on the other hand, it is interesting that Iran is bumping this issue of enrichment back to the agency and its interpretation under NPT law. So that's an interesting choice, and it doesn't surprise me because Iran often relies on arguments of international law as part of its public promotion of its calculations. On the other hand, I think it also showed that it was trying to still be pragmatic. It did not attack U.S. forces as a form of its retaliation. Instead, it pre-warned Qatar, and as we know, no lives were lost. And Qatar sort of took one for the team, if you will, but was assured by Iran that it would not sustain any damage. And I think what we see is that this is a situation that it's calculating that its relationship with the U.S. is now sort of at a draw, and that Trump is having to deal with its own political backlash. And so that for the moment, the likelihood of the U.S. rejoining any possible future Israeli attack is low. So I would say very briefly to sum up, I see Iran's strategic calculus evolving, not least because of the outcomes of the war. And I think from its perspective, it feels that none of its enemies' goals were achieved. Its nuclear program is alive and possibly salvageable. And it's possibly been able to hide its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Second of all, it weathered this 12-day Armageddon, even though its anti-missile fleet did not destroy a single Israeli warplane. And for the first time in memory, in memory, and certainly since the Iran-Iraq War, its cities suffered direct attacks. Even so, its own missiles were able to get through right to the very end, at the point where Trump was losing his temper with Netanyahu. And it was also showing that its missiles could pierce Israeli defenses. Third of all, the regime, though still very shaky, I think, especially after Khamenei's disappearance, is nonetheless still in its place. I would agree with Danny. It's consistently underestimated how deep this regime goes and how difficult it is to replace. And of course, there is no clear opposition organization. Fourth, and just to add to that, its population rallied around the flag. How long, we don't know, but certainly at the time of the war. And so fourth, it is still very much willing to engage in negotiations. As I've mentioned, I think it's a bit tricky that it's not going to allow IAEA inspections, but that may be a further leverage that it has with the United States, that this is something it will consider if real sanctions relief take place. And lastly, it has shown that despite the fact that Israel is no longer at risk of attack from the Arabs, Iran is still a heavyweight in the region. It is still a danger to Israel. And further, that Israel itself is not the regional hegemon, despite its narrative of changing the Middle East. So I think I'll stop there. There's also things to talk about its relationship with the Gulf and its need to reestablish its reliability and amity with this very important set of friends. But I think we can discuss that later.
Thank you very much, Roxanne. Now I want to bring in Farzan and turn it over to him, specifically concerning the point that Roxanne, you mentioned on Iran's changing nuclear doctrine and also the risk associated with that, understanding that Israeli attacks could be imminent if they move toward the building of nuclear bombs. And also, Farzan, if you can elaborate, because again, Roxanne raised that a bit on the role of the supreme leader in the decision-making process, especially knowing that he was gone for much of the wars. At least we didn't hear about him, or we don't know if there was a lot of access to him when it came to this, making important decisions by the Islamic Republic.
Well, I think Professor Farman made an excellent kind of presentation and layout of the facts. So I'm going to kind of incorporate your points and also maybe describe kind of my interpretation of the facts, especially where they might differ in some respects. So broadly speaking, Iran entered this conflict. And when I say this conflict, I don't mean this 12-day war. I mean the conflict that started after the 7th of October, which is, I think, really the parameter of the 20-month West Asian war that we should be talking about. It had three relatively robust pillars to its deterrence strategy. Of course, there's the Axis of Resistance Network and its various branches, its missile and drone program, and with a very large stockpile and a meaningful military-industrial base to kind of move it forward, and of course, its nuclear threshold status. During this 20-month period and through the 12-day war, obviously, we've seen these pillars significantly weaken, right? Obviously, the Levantine branches of the Axis of Resistance have been either significantly degraded to the point of not being kind of effective during the 12-day war. Its Iraq branch has been, let's say, divided and neutralized in terms of being able to take decisive action. We saw this to some extent in terms of the decision not to intervene in Syria. Part of it, I mean, obviously, a lot of that had to do with decision making in Tehran and kind of broader macro conditions. But we could also see that it was very difficult to create unity among the Shia groups as well as the Islamic resistance forces to have some type of a significant intervention to be able to save the Bashar al-Assad regime. And while probably the Houthis have turned out to be the all-star of the extra resistance in this conflict, they've also had their capabilities degraded. And again, in the specific context of this war, as far as I'm aware, there was no significant action on their part. I think Professor Fanoyan mentioned that the strategy was kind of dead. I agree that especially after the assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani, it started to decline. And for example, we saw the aerospace forces of the IRGC and their weapons platforms, and to a lesser extent the IRGC Navy and the innovations they were making, start to eclipse and kind of move ahead of, let's say, the IRGC Quds force. But the Islamic Republic had not abandoned this and remained a salient factor in its defense. And I can come back to this later, but it's also it couldn't surrender it or negotiate it away, despite the fact that it was becoming less important and is now degraded because of domestic political factors. And we can come back to that if anyone's interested. Of course, the missile and drone program, I think, demonstrated a much greater level of effectiveness. Perhaps not what we would expect from an advanced conventional military, but I think it did achieve the strategic purpose which was set out to achieve, which was to kind of inflict a cost for attacks on Iran. And of course, in terms of the specific damage caused, because of fairly effective Israeli information control and military censorship, it's hard to know just how effective, how ineffective the weapons were in terms of specifically targeting, striking, and destroying important military targets and infrastructure, so as tactical weapons. And finally, Iran's nuclear threshold status. Of course, Iran retains a meaningful and significant capacity. My understanding from kind of discussing with Iranian, American, and Israeli contacts is that Iran could still, for example, reach 90% enriched uranium relatively quickly. The problem is actually conducting a weapons test or building a nuclear explosive device, and then building enough of those to then have a robust deterrent, right? My understanding, for example, in terms of actually building a testable nuclear device or a deployable nuclear device, is that it could have been set back, whereas before I've heard estimates from people on the military intelligence side in Israel as low as 3 months to maybe 6 months before the war. The estimates I'm hearing now are more in the range of 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. So at the very moment where potentially a nuclear test, at least theoretically, could help it, it no longer retains that. And of course, as a result of this war, both the system, the Islamic Republic system, and society have been dealt a huge blow and shock. And I think the leadership decision-making has been disrupted, right? Ayatollah Khamenei is nowhere to be found. My understanding is, besides being kind of moved around in order to maintain cover not to be struck, he also has not been engaging in electronic communications, which of course slows down the ability to communicate, give decisions. And of course, the deliberative processes in Iran, because a lot of Iran's national security decision-making works through processes like the Supreme National Security Council, where it's interagency and kind of these various actors come together. Either a lot of those personnel have been killed, especially on important issues like the nuclear one, for example, Ali Shamkhani, or they're just not able to deliberate in the way they would have been best. And this process was viewed as being slow already. Right. So again, we shouldn't look at this war in the context of a 12-day campaign. We should look at the trajectory over 20 months. And even if the relative effectiveness in degrading the nuclear program in these 12 days was probably not as much as it's being presented by maybe both the Israelis and the Americans, if we look at this longer trajectory, the picture is not good for the Islamic Republic. And we have no reasonable expectation, right, that this trajectory can't continue. So just to quickly get into maybe one or two scenarios, I've kind of been reformulating my scenarios. They're not quite robust, but I think the two, let's say, mid to slightly more optimistic side of the scenarios, depending on how you view that, right? Scenario one I call kind of an unstable equilibrium, and this was before the end. I came up with before the end of the war, so I haven't upgraded them. In the unstable equilibrium scenario, obviously, the Islamic Republic resists but doesn't find an acceptable diplomatic off-ramp. Without large-scale U.S. entry, we had a limited U.S. entry. Israel declares victory, shifting to campaign between wars mode with less frequent but still semi-regular strikes or covert operations from the ground. And of course, state fragility can grow in this particular context. And I should note, while Israel has perhaps finished a certain phase of the campaign, going to some of what Danny said, I think we could see a subsequent phase which could more seriously attempt to destabilize the existing system in ways that I think most of us can probably imagine. Of course, there's a second scenario, and this is a scenario that I heard direct or indirectly, I should say, but coming from a very senior person in Iran's foreign policy establishment, which is that, and I call this scenario 2 Thermidor, and both these scenarios are overcoming maybe a 3 to 12-month period, which is that the system resists and eventually finds an acceptable diplomatic off-ramp in which it's still forced to kind of drink from the poison chalice, which is make massive concessions, but not completely humiliating ones. And so this would perhaps create a setup for the transformation of the system into kind of a third Islamic Republic that is much more moderate. I'll just touch on two quick points before I go. Regarding this idea that there was a rally around the flag effect in Iran, I completely disagree. I think Iranians' nationalism was severely provoked. No Iranian, or very few Iranians, liked their country attacked and like to see the country be humiliated. At the same time, I think people were most people, I should say, outside of the, let's say, the core supporters of the system, were kind of divided within themselves and ambivalent about how to feel. Because at the end of the day, one, the system failed to protect them. They had been told that they're sacrificing freedom and they're sacrificing prosperity for security. This, in the last decade especially, this has been kind of this security nationalism that the Islamic Republic, especially the IRGC, has been trying to sell. Actually, they didn't get security either. And the second thing is this, I think broadly speaking, this was also an unnecessary war that's driven by the ideology of the Islamic Republic. So people's nationalism was provoked, but they didn't necessarily rally around the flag of the Islamic Republic. And on the final point, I think there are, I think Professor mentioned that there's no opposition. I take a slightly different view, and I think there are scenarios which I would have taken much less seriously on the 12th of June, which are now growing in terms of their probability as we move forward and depending on how this situation evolves. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzan, for sharing your informative insights on the two scenarios, as well as the debate about the domestic politics and the reactions by the population, which is also something that is affecting both the United States, which we will discuss, as well as the region itself. But now I want to bring in Sheikh Nawaf to hear the perspectives from Qatar, as well as the broader Gulf. Given how much efforts the Gulf GCC countries in particular put into finding a diplomatic solution to this crisis, and then unfortunately paying the price for this war between Iran and Israel.
Thank you, Yunus, and thank you for inviting me to this, I think, timely session to discuss this matter. First of all, I think the biggest takeaway after what is now being coined the 12-day war, although it seemed much longer than 12 days, a lot of things happened, is that the region is still volatile. I think that many in the GCC viewed the actions by Israel not only a provocation, but also very reckless, because not only provoking Iran as a neighbor to the GCC, but also destabilizing the economic fiber of the region, with the Gulf being threatened. Many issues and questions were put during the operations of those 12 days about natural gas and oil fields that the Iranians have close to GCC countries like Qatar and others that have been struck or probably struck. Nothing was confirmed. There were reports, and that became an issue of great concern, because that widens the conflict. But what added to that overall disdain and worry from the GCC is the fact that everyone in the GCC kind of warned of that being the case. They warned that if this continued between Iran and Israel would have a washover effect and will widen, and it happened. So it wasn't a surprise to anyone. I think the second thing is that when Israel attacked Iran, it happened during the rounds of negotiation. In fact, a couple of days before the next round of negotiation between Iran and the United States, which is counterproductive to say the least. I mean, at least exhaust every method before going to kinetic action. But I think finally it kind of solidified a view in the Gulf that the current government in Israel, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, is clearly using internal political situations, problems, issues, concerns, to fuel any actions abroad as deflecting methodologies. Now, many in Israel could say that's not true. Well, the rest of the world actually sees it for what it is. It is true, and I mean, if nothing else, you see it in the United States even. I mean, who would think that now the MAGA base would be, against the actions by the Netanyahu government? Everyone expected Democrats to do that, but now when you have Steve Bannon calling for regime change, as he put it, but not in Iran, in Israel, I mean, that is a statement. That is a clear statement. But unfortunately, all of those efforts failed from the Arab states, mainly the GCC, and the war started to go beyond. The attack on the Qatari Air Force Base, Al Udeid Air Force Base, a few days ago was definitely something that the Qataris did not expect for it to happen. I think it really came as a surprise. Unfortunately, there is that misunderstanding and misinterpretation. People talk about, I think Yunus even mentioned symbolic or assured. Someone also mentioned that assured that Qatar will not be harmed. Look, this was the largest engagement of Patriot missiles, the largest barrage of Patriot missiles against a swarm of ballistic missiles. There are no guarantees in that scenario. Informed in advance, let's be quite honest. In 2025, the systems in place for many in the GCC countries, let alone the United States, and intelligence would have easily found out. In fact, it did pick up the actions, pinpointed the actions of the Iranian missile attack as it was happening for it to respond. So yes, having advance warning is nice. It's not the same as going and defending against that. And let me say, the Qatar Air Defense team and the Qatar Air Defense Forces and the Qatar Armed Forces, I think here in Qatar, at least, we viewed it, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States put it very well in his comments yesterday, acted in its first ever time operating in that quite successfully. 18 out of 19 ballistic missiles, one landed in an empty area. Now, again, when you deal with swarms like in Israel, if they get through, there are no guarantees. That is a Qatari base. It has part of it is operated by US and other allied forces, but it's a Qatari base. Base defense is Qatari. They were there, Qataris were there, and they, it is a dangerous situation. So I just don't want to make it seem like it was a walk in the park, because it is serious if we want to talk about a serious situation. Now, where do we go from here? I think this is an escalation that no one wants to see repeated, but I think Qatar, within hours of successfully defending the homeland, immediately switched gears. And I think, maybe we were less emotional than other countries when it comes to these kind of things, where Qatar kind of quickly switched gears within hours before the morning even came of that night, upon receiving a call from the Trump administration to mediate and de-escalate, did so, and we reached to the ceasefire that we're in here right now. It is still holding. I know the President of the United States was a bit bothered with Israel and Iran at the first hours that morning after, but I think it's still holding, and there is that opportunity to move forward. Qatar, Oman, the rest of the GCC continue to push for de-escalatory diplomacy and negotiations. That's the only way forward. But I think today, when it comes to our own homeland security, at least in Qatar, and I'm sure the rest of the GCC can feel the same way, we're more confident having seen our own forces, I think, behave valiantly and successfully in its first go around against the largest ballistic missile engagement with the Patriot in history. I think that at least gives us some confidence that while we are able to protect the homeland, there is no alternative to peace. And the eyes of the Gulf right now, post the 12-day war and its grand finale here in Qatar, I think is looking towards again Israel and Iran. Is there a willingness? Now the Iranians mentioned that there are willingness to move forward. The Israelis are not part of the negotiations per se because it's an American Iranian, but the Israelis get a vote, as we've seen in the past. And I think now is a very volatile time. A lot of people are celebrating the end of the war and the success of the Trump administration, and I think that is something to look at. But let's not be too let's not jump to conclusions right now and call this a complete peace and victory. I think there's much to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nawaf. I believe that much of the durability of this ceasefire depends on the US. And now I want to bring in John, and I wanted to bring you as the last speaker in this first round by purpose because the perspectives in DC pretty much shape what happens with respect to this war. This war, we all know, was launched with the full support from the Trump administration, and then after 12 days, it was put on pause through this ceasefire, again, largely because of the Trump administration's pressure on both Israel as well as Iran after the strikes against Iran's nuclear facility. So what were the thinking, in your view, and the objectives of the Trump administration for supporting this war launched by Israel against Iran? And what would be the path forward for the Trump administration? What does President Trump want to see now after this ceasefire?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me, Eunice. And I agree with all of my fellow panelists that this is really not over yet. Only a political solution will really bring this to a more permanent end state. I want to first say that prior to Israel launching its attacks, Trump actually withstood Israeli pressure and pressure from hawks in D.C. for military strikes on Iran. He publicly said he told Netanyahu no and that he was proceeding with negotiations. Uh, as has been detailed in length in reporting recently, obviously Trump caved to Netanyahu, and he had these war plans that were drawn up since last year. Netanyahu did. The messaging by the Trump administration in the very immediate aftermath of Israel's attacks was distancing. It tried to say this is an Israeli attack, so on and so forth. But I think once Israel started, as he referred to it, quote unquote, winning, in the sense that Iran did not respond with full force, I think Trump ultimately joined in and embraced the war. Though it should be noted, I would say, as everybody's really mentioned here, Israel was hit pretty hard, something that has not received a lot of attention in the press. But Trump's decision really highlighted the serious divide within the Republican Party and the MAGA movement itself that will be really consequential moving forward. I think at this point, characterizing anything as a foregone conclusion is wrong. There's too many unknowns. I think the United States got very lucky. But the core issue still exists, and it'll arguably be more difficult to tackle now. There's really a lot of puzzle pieces that need to fall into place for this to be translated into a strategic success. A puzzle that I should say was already pretty much complete under the JCPOA and could have been rather easily rebuilt if the administration stuck to the diplomatic route with realistic expectations. Putting this puzzle back together now is going to be more difficult when it really didn't have to be. For now, those calling for Trump not to cross the Rubicon into full-scale war and regime change have won. My main concern is the United States doubling down on maximalist demands in negotiations, particularly with respect to enrichment, and also the rising pressure from hawks in Washington and Israel for Trump to go further. We're already seeing that. Um, I saw a report yesterday citing anonymous Israeli officials in the Telegraph that Trump is demanding Iran hand over all of its enriched uranium. I think you're going to start seeing probably more of these reports as people try to shape the narrative to their own interests. You're going to see, oh, he's demanding this, he's demanding this. But historically, maximum pressure and so on has hardened Iran's resolve. I think there is a strong likelihood Iran will now see a nuclear weapon in the long term or the medium to long term as a necessary deterrent as a result of these strikes and as the regional balance of power tilts further away from Tehran. Again, I think we're going to see more pressure on Trump as more things come to light about the limits of the attacks, as we're already seeing. But I would say, from a U.S. policy perspective, more military action will incentivize Iran to go further towards the path of nuclearization. I think the past, the 12-day war, whatever you want to call it, really highlighted the problems of U.S. Middle East policy, where we often have these tactical successes, but that failed to be translated or that are typically translated into a strategic failure. U.S. Middle East policy really creates a lot of more problems than it solves, many with no connection to U.S. interests, and a lot of them are problems of choice. We often think that we're solving one problem while we're creating two, three, four in the process. So I think moving forward for the United States, it seems that Trump, for the time being, is not interested in further escalation. I hope that holds. I hope he stands firm against those who are going to pressure inevitably for him to go further, those who are going to try and put these poison pills back into negotiations. But there's just so many unknowns right now. But I think Trump realizes that a full-blown war with Iran is not in America's interests at all. It would drain America's magazine depth on critical weapon systems. We saw Israel was draining through their missile interceptors, and there was this question of whether the United States could step in and provide them with additional interceptors, given the fact that we're so involved in Ukraine and also trying to deter China in the Indo-Pacific. So I think for the time being, the skeptics have won. But if Trump ultimately caves to further pressure, I think this could go in a really dangerous direction.
Thank you very much, John. And this leads me to have this question, which is, I think we all agree that the ceasefire is very fragile, and there are many factors that could break this ceasefire, and then we see the second round of war between Iran and Israel. I want to understand and hear from Danny that under what conditions and circumstances Israel would see it as necessary to conduct another round of strikes, and to what extent you think Israelis can convince the Americans that this is absolutely necessary. And then I have on the same question, but posed to John, to what extent do you think the Trump administration can remain supportive of Israel if we're going to have the second round of attacks on Iran's nuclear sites or other facilities, military facilities?
Well, it's an important question. I just want to let what Farah said earlier, just to complete the previous discussion. The main reason that Israel went to this war, started this war, is not that we had an imminent threat that Iran will launch nuclear weapons against the state of Israel. The main reason was that we had a golden opportunity operationally because of the weekend of Hezbollah. The result of the 26th of October attack in Iran destroyed the strategic air defense system of Iran. And of course, the green light that we got from President Trump after he understood there is not going to be any agreement that Iran will forgo its enrichment capabilities. So in Iran, so I think that and we had an emerging threat in terms of what's happening in the nuclear side and the missile side. But I think that's the issue of the weakening of the axis of resistance was definitely Hezbollah. was one main generator that pushed Israel to this strike. Regarding your question, that's a very important one because given the statement that the Minister of Defense said yesterday, he instructed the IDF actually to attack Iran anytime that we identify not only activity on the nuclear side, but also on building capabilities that will harm the Israeli air superiority in Iran, but also, of course, the missile buildup. So if that is true, and we know that the Iranians intend to do so, we are on the verge of a renewed attack. Now, there are, let's say, senior figures in the Israeli defense establishment that are talking to the U.S. Newspaper, saying that regarding nuclear is true, but regarding missile capabilities, well, maybe we can find other mechanisms. So I think that also in Israel, people understand that it's not the best of our interest because we could find ourselves in a renewed attrition war. And again, we had a superiority and we attacked the Iranians and we weakened them. And I think only now they really understand what happened now in the war. But we cannot forget what happened in the Israeli home front and the impact of the Iranian missiles on the Israeli population and the fact that the money-wise, this only the war cost 22 billion shekels. So, and not talking about the need to rebuild infrastructure in Israel, not talking about the preparation for the war itself that probably cost a lot of other millions. So I think that people in Israel trying to understand or beginning to understand that we cannot find ourselves in a war of attrition. But according to the Minister of Defense, we are on the verge of a new strike, so maybe a war with Iran. So we have to take that into consideration. We don't know what will happen until we don't know, because now we're highly dependent on the intel, right? Because on the nuclear side, there is no inspection, there is no IAEA regime. So we'll have to know if we know. We have to rely only on intel, and we know intel is great, but we cannot have 100% all the time. This is one aspect. And the other aspect is the fact that we might find ourselves in a clash with China or with Russia, because if, for example, the Chinese will send a squadron of J-10 to Tehran, what is going to do? We're going to attack the squadron itself. So there's a lot of questions because Israel is taking some sort of overall responsibility of any buildup in Iran, like it tried to do in Hamas and Hezbollah, like we're doing actually today. Actually, we dropped bombs today in the southern Lebanon. So I think that the problem is that Israel thinking that it can try to mourn alone in Iran like it did in Lebanon, but I think that the Iranian response will be different. Yes, they had major setback, but I think they still have capabilities to cause damage in Israel, like the last barrage of missiles before the ceasefire have shown us, the attack in Beersheba. So the bottom line is that we don't know how things will develop, but if we're taking only the declarations coming from Israel from one hand and Iran from the other hand, then obviously without a political settlement that will increase our understanding what's happening in the nuclear side, create some sort of rule of the game between Israel, US, EIA, and Iran, we are in a phase of a renewed escalation that nobody knows how it can end. We can, like John, my friend, said, we can see the US joining in Israel, maybe trying to topple the regime, or other things that will develop. But definitely, one thing is important to say. Based on the current situation, the unstable situation that we encounter now, I think that the probability of renewed war is not something that we need to underestimate it. I think that as Iran will build its capabilities, the chances of Israel do something are higher than ever.
Thank you, Danny. And I want to get the reactions from John. If, let's say, let's not hope that's the case, but if that's the case, what would be the US reaction to Trump's calculation? And how long do you think the Trump administration can continue supporting Israel, knowing that Iran's preferred strategy is the war of attrition? Despite how costly it can be for the country, and even and by the cost, I just don't mean the militarily and economically, but also by losing the popular support and that nationalism sentiment that Farzan and Roxanne talked about.
Yeah, I think it places the United States in a really precarious position, especially because regardless of what one thinks of the MAGA movement and so on, this aversion to endless entanglements and the forever wars abroad, this played a central role in Trump's election. So it regardless of what one thinks of the broader agenda, Trump, by pursuing down that worst case scenario path, really risks blowing up his own coalition, and we've seen that over the past couple of weeks. These divides. You have people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Steve Bannon, really coming out swinging pretty hard in ways that I wouldn't have expected prior. Tip my hat to those who really did, stand on the principle of averting these forever wars. But it's exemplary of another key divide within Washington, D.C., which is inside the Republican Party, between these neocons and between this more MAGA wing. And especially with the Democrats in what I would consider, pretty much disarray. Uh, Trump would risk undermining the entirety of his agenda through such a war. And it's not as if I agree with the agenda and so on, but from a perspective of his interest, because I don't think at the end of the day Trump is ideological. I think he just appropriates whatever he thinks is going to be best for him. So from his perspective, if you're trying to sell this to the man, I think emphasizing the fact that this will immediately draw the United States into a war of attrition. This will overextend us abroad tremendously, and it's going to undermine almost the entirety of his platform, especially in a way really that Gaza did to Joe Biden, but on a scale of 10 times worse. So we're already seeing elements of the neocons and the more hawkish factions calling for Trump to go back in. Perhaps Trump thinks, that he can do this one-off and just wipe his hands of it. Declare that the nuclear program was totally obliterated and just, move forward. Whether or not that's sustainable is yet to be seen, especially as Iran's resolve is probably hardened and its desire for a nuclear weapon, if I was Khamenei, would be greater. We're really venturing into really uncharted territory.
Thank you, John. I want to now hand it over to Roxanne to discuss Iran's options if such a second wave of attack take place against the country. And I mean, we now discuss. I mean, of course, if Iran's attacks, Iran will respond in some sorts of a military action. But also on the diplomatic front, would that put kind of a pressure on the Islamic Republic to take a diplomatic route more seriously, knowing that how much they can also get hit while hitting Israel here and there. And Israel, despite what Danny said in terms of the cost of this war already for the nation, they have the backing of the United States. And we saw during this 12-day war that Russia and China, even though there were a lot of condemnation statements, at least publicly, we didn't see much support on the ground to help Iran in this war with Israel. And then I'll go to Nawaf regarding the role that Qataris can play in order to avoid such unfortunate scenario from happening again in the region.
I'll make it brief, but I think that it would be an extremely challenging next stage for Iran. I think there are a number of elements in play. I think it's not, as I think many of those on the outside felt, it's not a war economy. It's got a very deep industrial economy that eventually could probably turn into rather a powerful war economy. But today, as we speak, it's not geared up for that. So it's a little bit what you see is what you get. It's had a great number of its missiles destroyed. And I don't think it has so many that it can do a whole nother round equally effectively. So it's not got the same resources at the moment. I think Faizan and I may be talking at different sides of the same phenomenon. I think we would in any case agree that over some time, maybe a whole nother round, popular support will wane. I think it will be viewed as this is certainly above what the population would want to be sacrificing for. And I think also what Israel is not we would not characterize Israel with this, but I think we could characterize Iran with it, is it's very concerned about regionalizing the war. It has said that a lot. I think it is trying to hedge its bets, if you will, but it wants to stay online on good relations with with its very hard fought neighborhood, in the sense of coming to be part of that neighborhood. And that, of course, took place at the time that China stepped in and helped facilitate the Saudi-Iran reconciliation. But it has delivered many, many dividends. And I think Iran is so isolated and has been so on its own, as we see in this war, that it is very valuable to it, that it is an upstanding member, if you will, of its region. And so it doesn't want to regionalize this any more than it has to. So I think it would be extremely difficult for Iran to mount the same kind of response. I think, yes, it would be, Eunice, very likely that it would have to negotiate a lot further. And then we come into the complication of when would this happen? Because if it gets too close to the October deadline of the expiration of the JCPOA, and it once again is threatened by significant sanctions, in a way, this all starts looking very negative towards the regime. Nonetheless, it being a difficult one to overthrow, but it could certainly undergo some destabilization and shift into a coup situation with the IRGC. But we're getting into this. I'm projecting too much. I think that it would be difficult, let's say, and leave it at that.
Thank you, Roxanne. Over to you, Nabaf, about the role that Qatar and other GCC countries can play in order to avoid such scenario from happening.
Well, I mean, the role that Qatar and the GCC, like Oman, has played recently, and hopefully the GCC, whether Qatar, Oman, or a combination of the 6 countries or a few of those countries could do, is all informed by the situation that's going on right now. So the war is between Israel and Iran. The negotiation is between America and Iran. One does not lead to resolving another. And that disconnect is an issue for any mediator, because in the end, a mediator is just a mediator. We don't negotiate, and we don't come up with conclusions. So even before any mediation or any negotiation, in fact, at the tail of the last negotiation, while it was going, the war happened. There was clear differences between the U.S. and Israel. So it's unclear how one is connected to the other. In fact, I believe there is a chasm between what the U.S. believes is a doable agreement with Iran to move forward and what the Israelis would want the Iranians to do. And again, those two parties are not talking, let alone even discussing the possibility of negotiation. So that disconnect, we have to realize, is going to be a big challenge in preventing or even attempting to prevent a future war. But there's another part of that. The second part is, I don't believe, in fact, I'm pretty convinced that in any other future engagement between Israel and Iran, I don't believe the U.S. will take part. I think the Trump administration is in this mode of one and done. I think both the U.S. administration and the rest of the world heard Netanyahu saying that it's so the Iranian nuclear program is so urgent, it's going to happen in a year or just over a year. The last interview he gave to ABC, and adding to that, the past quarter of century, according to Netanyahu, for a quarter of century, Iran was only weeks away and months away from a nuclear bomb. I think the U.S. Republican MAGA base has reached a point where they've heard Netanyahu cry wolf many times. I don't think the U.S. will support, and kinetically they will support Israel always with weapons, but kinetically I think that's going to be a challenge if Israel wants to resolve a political issue through military means, which is never resolvable. I think The bigger question will be, how are negotiations connected to Israel and its perceived probable kinetic actions? And again, the idea that's growing in this part of the world and in Europe, as I've spoken to many of my colleagues and academics and think tankers in Europe and in the US, of, well, this is politically motivated and it's not a true threat to Israel. It's politically motivated when it comes to Netanyahu's actions. All of that, I think, have to be weighed against the possibility of this flaring up again. And I hate to say it, it's not looking good. It's holding right now, and hopefully Iran goes into negotiations with the US. But the connection between what happens with that and Israel is unclear at this point, at best.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Nawaf. As we are nearing the end of the session, I want to propose the last question, very much focused on the potential diplomatic solutions that can hopefully end this war, and here, how the Iranians would approach it, as well as the Americans and the Israelis. Having followed the Iranian discussions after the war, there seems to be a confusion regarding Trump's real intention with Iran. At one point, you hear him supporting the regime change and then lifting sanctions, and now the reports of the US wanting to invest in Iran, billions in reconstructing or developing Iran's nuclear program that it destroyed. So Iranians have a hard time reading what Trump really wants to do, and they feel betrayed as they were attacked while they were scheduled to negotiate with the Americans in Oman. But then the question becomes, what would be the diplomatic solution here? Are we still, especially from the American perspective, John, are we still, the enrichment is still a red line for the US as well as the Israelis, or can be a solution in which Iran still can enrich uranium, but under supervision of the Americans themselves? That was one of the proposals in the consortium. And then I want to hear Danny's perspective, and then Farzan as well.
Sure. I think any diplomatic solution, I would say, is preferable to war, obviously. And whether or not the United States allows domestic enrichment, or whether it's this consortium idea, I think all of these avenues need to be explored to avert, the worst case scenario. But I would just say, within Washington, D.C., the debate on Iran has historically, it's two debates, really, that are often get muddied together, often deliberately. But it's really two debates going on. One debate is about nuclear non-proliferation and the best ways to achieve this. Nearly the entire arms control community was unanimous in saying that the JCPOA on that matter worked. Was it a silver bullet to cure every single thing related to Iran? No, it wasn't intended to do that. But in that sense, it worked. And returning to some sort of deal resembling the JCPOA was certainly possible before the war. There were even rumors that instead of a 15-year sunset clause, they'd have a 25-year sunset clause. And Trump, being the salesman, erratic dude that he is, he could sell that as, better than the JCPOA, whatever. But that's one debate, the nuclear non-proliferation debate. The other debate is the regime change debate. And for those hawkish individuals in Israel and Washington, D.C., who view Iran as the chief problem in the region, any deal with Tehran, any deal, is viewed, one, as a form of appeasement, two, as something that would block their path towards their ultimate objective, which is regime change. So in Washington, these two debates are often muddied together. They're happening side by side. But if Trump and his team remain laser focused on the nuclear non-proliferation, there is a deal to be had here, certainly. It's a matter of whether he can hold his ground against the Mark Levins, the Mark Dubowitzes of the world in Washington, who are already, and the Lindsey Grahams, who are already screaming in his ear, no, you need to go back in, because the nuclear issue isn't the problem. It's the country, it's the regime. You need to take out the Islamic Republic.
Thank you, John. Over to you, Roxanne.
Oh, I'd love to hear what Farzan has to say. I simply will very quickly say that I agree that there are two different, very much with Nawad. I think there's two different scenarios going on with the United States and with Israel. And I think this is really difficult for Iran because even if it does sign something with the United States, there's no guarantee that the Israelis are going to accept it. And unless Israel is told definitively by Trump as part of that deal, do not attack. This is our deal. We're thrilled with this. This is the regime we've signed it with. I do not see the attack, the certainly even a lower grade war not continuing with Israel. And that's very difficult, I think, for Iran. So I do agree with you, Noah, a lot completely about that. And I think that keeps destabilizing the whole region. And I think, unfortunately, it's usually Iran that gets blamed for that as the regime that needs to be taken out, which relates to what John was saying.
Thank you, Roxanne. Farzan, over to you.
Yeah, so I completely agree with Professor Farman. I think part of the issue is that in a lot of Iran's attempts since the mid-1990s to get some kind of détente with the United States, it's thought that it could go around the Israel issue. And increasingly, we've realized that it can't, and that was reaffirmed by the experience after the JCPOA and the subsequent attempts at talks under Biden and Trump. During the kind of track point 5 processes before the 12-day war, my whole narrative, at least for the 6 months, going back 6 months, and increasingly after the 7th of October, was that go big or go home, right? Basically, in the last 7 years, the paths to some kind of peaceful off-ramp have been narrowing. And so I'm not going to present that framework, the framework that I'll present, just very basic outlines. I don't think it's realistic right now from either side. I think it's potentially possible in, let's say, the medium to long term. So on the kind of enrichment side, I think, even when the Islamic Republic, assuming, we're not talking about some extreme scenarios, even when it accepted a ceasefire and drank from the poison challenge, it didn't capitulate, right? What the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was accepting was that he wasn't going to achieve the kind of goal of militarily defeating Iraq and carrying out regime change in Baghdad, right? So for me, drinking from the poison chalice or making major concessions doesn't mean that Iran surrenders on the principle of enrichment. It means that it retains the right to enrich and perhaps has a baseline or symbolic level of enrichment very tightly tied to its civil needs, but that it voluntarily agrees not to exceed that at all. So none of the kind of industrial level, kind of what it has right now, and either has no sunsets or a decade-long set of decades long, sorry, so 20, 30 years set of kind of time limits at the kind of in the long term. It would also include monitoring, safeguards, and transparency measures above and beyond the JCPOA and what the arrangements Iran previously had with the IAEA under the NPT as well. I think a third important element would probably be some form of an end to military support for the elements of the acts of resistance, specifically aimed at Israel and probably the U.S. as well. Something I heard about a kind of a foreign policy event with people from across the political spectrum in Iran, in foreign policy, except the most hardline people, including a representative from a very senior ex-IRGC commander. And it seemed that actually many people in that discussion at the dinner after agreed that acts of resistance had lost its utility and it needed to go. What was the problem? The problem was that, and this is the phrasing I heard, that whoever does that would meet the fate of Yitzhak Rabin in Iran, which I found to be quite interesting. And the final point is that the Islamic Republic would probably have to give some kind of credible signal of the end of its intent to destroy the Islamic Republic. How does it do that with Khamenei still in power and with many of the figures who've been shouting death to America, death to Israel for the last 46 years? It's unclear. Because, I think from an Israeli perspective, now that they've started this, they've gone this far, it's probably very difficult to leave your adversary kind of fully or intact, and give it the time and states it needs to potentially rebuild itself to strike you back. I don't think America's and Israel's problem is really with 3.67% enrichment of Iran. It's about the nature of the system behind that enrichment, and then again, giving a credible signal of change of intent towards Israel and ultimately the United States.
Thank you, Farzan. Now I want to bring in Danny for the final remarks before I turn to Nawaf. So based on what Farzan and Roxanne and then John before he left, there seems to be the main goal for Israel or the undeclared war is regime change, or at least changing the nature of the Islamic Republic in the sense that it would not pose the threats that it's been posing towards Israel since its establishment. Understanding this, do you think is there any diplomatic solution that would be actually accepted by Israel and the Netanyahu's government, or the plan is to have regime change one way or another?
Well, the short answer to this important question is no. Israel has no intention or to agree to any sort of a political solution. It will aim of Israel is a regime change. We saw that also in the war itself. Unfortunately, as we know, it was very hard to do so. There's no viable opposition and only airstrikes and et cetera, et cetera. But this is what Israel is intent to do. And any agreement with Iran will enable some sort of significant economical relief that actually will strengthen the regime itself. I think that Israel rely on the Iranian response, that it still seek enrichment in Iran, and still seek a buildup of its missile capabilities in a way that actually it will say no to every U.S. proposal, given the understanding that what really the U.S. wants is using economical leverage to force Iranian to forego their capabilities and nuclear, maybe conventional capabilities, and I don't see, despite everything that happened in the last 12 days, Iranian accepting that. Even if they will offer them the moon, at the end of the day, Iran will insist on enrichment and insist on definitely the force buildup on the conventional side. So I think Israel builds on that. I think Israel builds on the fact that the regime will be weakened. And I think that Israel builds on that if push comes to shove and find ourselves in another scenario of escalation with Iran, we're able to withdraw the US back, supporting us, making sure that this time maybe we can go the extra mile in the war against the regime itself. So again, the final I think again the short answer is no. Israel have no intention to agree to that. There is one, of course, element that we have to calculate is the issue of the influence of President Trump or President Netanyahu. Those two individuals are working now probably on something big in terms of some sort of political, diplomatic solution to the Middle Eastern problems. And again, I don't know how the Iranian issue will be embedded within that. Basically, it seems that what they try to do, they try to use the war in Iran to initiate the normalization process with Israel, between Saudi Arabia and Israel, ending the war in Gaza, and some sort of a political solution to the Palestinian problem, not someone asking the Palestinians, in a way that it will build on the war and finding permanent solution to the Middle Eastern problems. I'm very skeptical of that, but we have to wait and see how much Trump will force Netanyahu or go with him to this plan, and how much the agreement with Iran will be a part of it. So the last thing I'll say about that is obviously Israel is against any agreement with Iran unless it will be forced by the US with some guarantees. And then we'll see Israel agree reluctantly. But I think Israel is quite content about the situation right now. Iran is still under a lot of pressure. It didn't renew its capabilities for now, of course. It's still early to call. And it's maybe will suffer for the snapback in the near future. And Israel, there's nothing that the Iranians are getting in terms of any sort of aid, economically or militarily. So I think Israel is very content right now. But as we said previously at the beginning of this important gathering, that if Iran will renew its capabilities or try to renew its capabilities in terms of conventional and nuclear side, obviously Israel has to do something. And I don't think Israel will be hesitant to attack Iran again. It's not something that we look for in terms of some sort of attrition war, but I think, as people are saying here, Israel after 7th of October won't accepting the fact that our fierce enemy rebuilt itself after the war that we had. So last but not least, a very unstable situation right now.
Just a very quick follow-up question for you, Danny. Is this position that you just described associated mainly with the Netanyahu's government and his coalition? Or let's say if there is an election that could change, because following the Iranian officials through the state media, what I noticed in terms of the difference before and after the war, the public narrative was very much directed at Netanyahu himself, trying to build both pressure internationally, but also, having some Israeli media cover the Iranian media outlets to send signals to the Israelis that it's all Netanyahu that is pushing for this. And if, let's say, we have a change of government in Israel, we're still expecting the same position, or are we going to see a bit of difference?
I think we should expect the same and even worse. In Israel, there is no position for the Iranian issue. We saw also, Netanyahu is a very, let's say, questionable prime minister in terms of opposition. A lot of people in Israel questioning his motives about the things that he's doing, serving his interest or Israel interest. But when the war started with Iran, we just saw rally around the flag. Everybody is sure, and again, I can't say yes or no, but this is the situation in Israel, that what Netanyahu did actually saved Israel from an imminent threat, existential threat, and he get a lot of support by it, and actually he considering exiting for election because of his achievement in the war against Iran. It's actually his thing that make people forget what happened on 7th of October. But even if there will be election in Israel, election in Israel is supposed to be only October next year, but assuming that he will find a way to conduct them in the next 3 to 6 months, and someone from opposition will be elected, unfortunately, I don't see any change. On the contrary, politicians in Israel understand that if you want to be seen as strong, you have to portray a strong policy towards Iran, that it's the snakehead and whatever. And actually, we saw that when Bennett was prime minister. He did the same thing, even worse. So I think I don't see any change in the Israeli policy towards Iran, regardless of what will happen in the domestic political system in Israel. And I think what's being scheduled out, the benchmarks now, actually will be the benchmark also for the future government in Israel. Yes, can be changes in terms of the Palestinian issue maybe, or normalization with Saudi Arabia, but all in all, against Iran, I don't see any change. And actually, I think it can really deteriorate, because those who replace Netanyahu will want to make sure that people understand that they are fierce at him regarding the Iranian issue. So I don't see any change in that.
Thank you, Danny. Now over to Sheikh Nawaf for your final remarks.
Well, finally, I would say that the only way forward is through negotiations. The concerns remain. One of them is, unfortunately, right now we're talking about negotiations between the US and Iran, but we're asking about effects between Iran and Israel. Those two are not necessarily connected. In fact, in many ways, if we use JCPOA as the outcome, for instance, of a potential agreement, let's say a JCPOA 2.0, then that does not guarantee issues dealing with other elements, the least of which is regime change. The most prominent could be if like JCPOA the first time around, the JCPOA the first time around, was the ballistic missiles and the capabilities left intact. All of that is concerning, obviously. Now, looking at all of this, we have to also acknowledge that Israel, while it does get a vote to a certain extent, and I mentioned that a minute ago, it does not have a full say when it comes to what the US agrees with Iran. And the Israelis could say, we do not agree. That is understandable. But it is what you've mentioned a minute ago about the Iranian media. It is a sad state of affairs for Netanyahu when you've got both the Islamic Republic of Iran and the MAGA base in the United States agreeing that they don't want you. That is not a good position for the Israeli government. Now, if another hardliner comes into power with the same views of Netanyahu, but lacks the magic touch that Netanyahu has with American media, I don't think it's a good situation for Israel. I think it goes even worse. The only way forward is really to look through, not seeking forever wars, sidelining the neocons that wants to bring the rest of the region and bring in America to forever wars, and move forward to negotiation. But that's a question that only the Israelis internally could answer between themselves and their government. And unfortunately, the rest of us can only wait and see where it goes from there. But thank you for this timely panel, and I thank my panelists. I think they were great, and hopefully next time we'll come here with better outviews and outlooks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Nabaf. Yes, some of our panelists had other engagement as we've gone over time, but also thanks to you, Farzan, and all the online audience that we have in the room. We will publish the recorded video of this panel and share the links on our social media accounts, and we'll send you an email as well to watch it later if you want, and feel free to share it amongst your network. Thank you. Take care.